You are standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable every time you board a cruise ship, and most people never stop to think about that. They see the glittering lights strung along the upper decks, the towering white hull that seems to scrape the sky, the endless buffet tables, and the steel drum music, and the faint chemical smell of chlorine mixing with salt air, and they think they are walking into a floating hotel, a vacation, a controlled and comfortable experience. They are wrong. The ocean does not care about your itinerary. The ocean does not care about your cabin upgrade or your drink package or the photograph you took standing at the bow with your arms spread wide. What happens on the water, far from shore, far from cell towers and emergency rooms, and the particular comfort of solid ground underfoot, belongs to a different category of experience entirely. Welcome to Midnight Outcry. Tonight we are going to the sea, and we are bringing with us 9 accounts from 9 different people who went out on the water and came back changed. Names and specific identifying details have been altered throughout this video to protect the privacy and safety of those who were willing to share what happened to them, but the core of every single experience you are about to hear has not been touched. These are their words, their memories, their sleepless nights given shape and sound. If you are new here, this is what we do. We take the experiences that do not fit anywhere else, and we give them a place to live. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. Now, let us go out to sea. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I was 34 years old when this happened to me, working as a marine engineer with 11 years of experience on commercial vessels before I ever set foot on a passenger ship. I knew engines. I knew the language of hull pressure and ballast tanks, and the specific vibration frequency that tells you something below the waterline is not right. I was not a nervous man. I was not the kind of person who startled easily. When the cruise line offered me a contract position doing routine maintenance assessments on one of their older vessels during a 14-day Caribbean run, I took it without hesitation. It was good money, and I had done harder things in worse conditions on cargo ships in the North Atlantic. This was supposed to be easy. The ship was called the Adriana Celestine, a mid-size vessel carrying around 1,800 passengers and 600 crew, running a route from Miami down through the Eastern Caribbean and back. I boarded in Miami on a Tuesday in late October, was shown to my crew quarters below the waterline on deck 2, and spent the first day getting oriented. The ship smelled the way all ships smell below the passenger decks, a combination of diesel and treated water, and the particular metallic sharpness of recycled air that has been through too many filtration cycles. It is not an unpleasant smell if you have grown up in it the way I had. It felt like home. The engine room on the Adriana was older than I expected, retrofitted in some areas but fundamentally a 1990s design, and I spent the first 2 days cataloging the systems, taking notes, running diagnostics. Everything checked out. Everything was well within acceptable parameters. On the 3rd night, somewhere south of the Bahamas, I was finishing a late inspection of the auxiliary power systems when I noticed that one of the maintenance hatches on the port side of the lower engineering deck was open about 3 inches. It was nothing. Hatches vibrate loose sometimes. I closed it, checked the latch, moved on. That was the first thing. The second thing happened the following afternoon. I was running a pressure check on one of the secondary water systems when I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the kind that do not have anywhere particular to be. I turned around. The corridor was empty. It was a low-ceilinged passage painted industrial gray, lit by fluorescent strips, running about 40 feet before bending to the right. There was no one there. I told myself it was sound traveling strangely through the hull, which happens constantly on ships. The steel carries vibration in peculiar ways, and what sounds like footsteps is often just the ship talking to itself. I wrote it down in my notes, because that is the habit of a good engineer, documenting anomalies without over-interpreting them, and then I kept working. The 3rd night is when things stopped being easy to explain. I woke at around 2 in the morning to the sound of someone knocking on my cabin door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate. I lay there for a moment, fully awake the way you get when something pulls you out of deep sleep, and then I got up and opened the door. The corridor outside my cabin was completely empty. The lighting at that hour was reduced to about 30%, casting long shadows between the cabin doors, and I stood there looking in both directions for a good 30 seconds before I accepted that there was no one there. A passenger who had taken a wrong turn, I decided. Someone looking for a bathroom. I closed the door and lay back down and listened to the engines, and eventually I slept. The fourth day was calm and bright, and the sea was almost completely flat. I did my work. I ate in the crew mess. I talked to one of the other engineers, a man named Tobias, who had been on the Adriana for 3 years, and at some point in the conversation I mentioned the footsteps and the knocking and the hatch. He looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and then he said, quietly, that the lower decks on this ship had a history. He did not elaborate. I asked him what kind of history, and he looked away and said he had heard things too, sometimes, and that the best approach was to ignore them. I pressed him, and he changed the subject, and I did not get another word about it out of him for the rest of the voyage. That night I went back to the portside corridor on the lower engineering deck, because I am an engineer, and I do not leave anomalies uninvestigated. I brought my flashlight and my tablet, and I walked the full length of the corridor doing a visual inspection of every hatch, every conduit, every access panel. Everything was secured. Everything was normal. I was almost at the far end of the corridor when my flashlight caught something at floor level that stopped me completely. Handprints. 2 of them, pressed flat against the painted steel floor in what appeared to be condensation, but the shape was wrong for condensation. They were too defined, too intentional. Adult-sized fingers slightly splayed, both hands side by side, as though something had been lying face down on the floor and pushing itself up. I crouched down and touched the surface. The floor was completely dry. The handprints were on a dry surface, and I could not explain them, and something in my chest went very quiet and very cold. I stood up slowly. I turned around. At the far end of the corridor, at the bend where the passage curved right, there was something standing in the shadows. I cannot give you a complete description because my brain did not process it as a complete picture. I saw a shape, the approximate height and mass of a person, but with something wrong about the proportions, something wrong about the way it occupied the space it was standing in. It was not moving. I stood there for what felt like a very long time, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 10, and then I walked toward it. I do not know why I walked toward it. I think my body was running on professional instinct, the same instinct that makes you walk toward an unfamiliar sound in an engine room rather than away from it. When I reached the bend in the corridor, there was nothing there, no one. I put my hand on the wall at the bend, and it was cold, not the ambient cold of an air-conditioned space. Cold the way a window is cold in winter. I went back to my cabin, and I did not sleep. In the morning I reported what I had seen to the chief of security on the vessel, a former Navy officer who listened to my account with a politely blank expression, and then told me that the lower decks sometimes got cold drafts from the refrigeration systems, and that my eyes had probably adjusted poorly to the low light. He filed a report. I have a copy of it. It describes the incident as crew member experienced perceptual disturbance due to fatigue. I had been sleeping 8 hours a night. I was not fatigued. The rest of the voyage I worked quickly and stayed out of the lower engineering corridor after dark. I finished my assessment, submitted my report, and disembarked in Miami with everyone else. 3 days later, I noticed that the skin on my right hand, the hand I had pressed against that cold wall, had developed a series of small circular marks across the palm. The ship's doctor had looked at my hand when I reported it before disembarking and said it was likely a contact dermatitis reaction. The marks are still there. They have never fully faded. I have shown them to 4 different dermatologists, and none of them have been able to identify the specific pattern. I looked up the Adriana Celestine service history 2 months after I got home. She had been dry docked for 6 months in 2009, following an incident that the company's official records describe only as an unresolved crew matter. The details of that incident are not publicly available. I have submitted 3 separate information requests. All 3 have been denied. The account I just shared came to me from Daniel through a mutual contact in the maritime industry, and I want to give you a moment to sit with the particular texture of it before we move to the next experience, because there is something about the way he tells it that distinguishes it from the kind of story people invent for attention. The specificity, the way he keeps reaching for the professional explanation even after the professional explanation has stopped working. That quality is something I have heard from nearly everyone on this list, and the next narrator has it in full measure. My name is Priya Sandoval, and I was 28 years old, a licensed paramedic with 6 years of field experience, when I took a position as part of the medical team on a cruise ship running a 2-week Alaska and Pacific Northwest itinerary. I had applied for the position partly for the experience and partly because I had grown up in Phoenix and had never seen that part of the coast, those narrow channels between mountains and water, the way the light falls gray and flat and ancient on everything up there. The ship was mid-sized, around 1,200 passengers, and my job was to assist with medical triage in the onboard clinic during the voyage. Routine work, seasickness, minor injuries, the occasional allergic reaction. I was good at my job, and I was not easily shaken by anything a body could do. The Alaskan coast did something to me from the first day that I did not expect and cannot fully articulate. Standing on the deck as we moved through the inside passage felt like standing inside something that was very old and had not decided yet whether it was aware of you. The trees came down to the water's edge in absolute density, black-green and impenetrable, and sometimes you would see a waterfall dropping straight off a cliff face into the channel, and there was something about the scale of it, the indifference of it, that made me feel the ship was a very small thing in a very large conversation that it had not been invited to join. That feeling was not fear exactly. It was something more like respect. I noticed it and noted it and kept working. The first thing happened on the 4th night, sometime after midnight. I was on call and sleeping lightly in my cabin when the ship's internal phone rang, and I was told there was a passenger reporting distress on deck 7, the topmost passenger deck, open air at the stern. I pulled on my jacket and took my kit and went up. When I arrived, there was a woman standing at the stern rail, not in any danger, not leaning over, just standing there with her hands at her sides looking out at the water. She was in her late 50s, well dressed, and she turned when she heard me coming and said she was sorry, she had not meant to alarm anyone. She had been out for some air, and another passenger must have called the crew. She seemed completely calm. I asked her if she was feeling all right, and she said yes, she was fine. She had just been watching the lights in the water. I looked out. The water behind the ship was dark and calm. There were no lights. I told her I did not see any lights, and she looked at me, and then looked back at the water and said nothing. I walked her back inside and went back to my cabin. The phrase she used stayed with me. Not light on the water, the way you describe a reflection. Lights in the water, below the surface. 3 nights later, I was doing a routine late check of the medical supply inventory when one of the junior crew members, a young Romanian man named Andrei, who worked in housekeeping, knocked on the clinic door and asked if he could come in. He sat down and told me, haltingly, that he had seen something in the water that afternoon while doing maintenance on the exterior deck. He described a shape moving alongside the hull at a depth he estimated at about 20 feet, keeping pace with the ship. He said it was large. He said it was not a whale and not a shark, and that it had moved in a way he had not seen any animal move, not undulating, not swimming, but traveling through the water, the way a shadow travels across a wall, without apparent effort, and without disturbing the water around it. He was visibly frightened. I told him it was likely a bioluminescent phenomenon of some kind, which can produce extraordinarily strange visual effects at depth. He looked at me and said he had already told himself that, twice, and that he did not believe it. He left, and I sat with the inventory half finished and listened to the water moving against the hull. On the 9th night, 3 days before the end of the voyage, I woke at around 3 in the morning to a sound I still do not have an adequate word for. It was low and rhythmic, and it seemed to be coming from directly outside my cabin's hull side wall. My cabin was below the waterline, and the outer wall was a few inches of steel between me and the open ocean. The sound was not a mechanical sound. It was not the engines or the hull flexing, or any of the dozens of normal sounds a ship makes. It had a quality of intentionality to it, the way a knock on a door has intentionality, a pattern that suggested a source that was choosing to make it. I lay completely still for what I estimate was 4 minutes, listening. Then it stopped. I got up and pressed my palm flat against the outer wall. The wall was vibrating very slightly, in a way that was not consistent with the engine vibration I had been sleeping through for 9 nights. Then the vibration stopped too. In the morning I went to the bridge and asked the officer on watch if there had been any sonar anomalies overnight. He told me the sonar had shown an unidentified mass pacing the ship for approximately 40 minutes between 2:40 and 3:20 in the morning, and that the captain had logged it as a probable geological formation on the seafloor, though we had been in deep open water with no seafloor features mapped within several miles. He told me this casually, as though it were completely unremarkable, and I did not press him because I could see in his face that he was working very hard to believe his own explanation. I finished the voyage without further incident. I did not sleep well for the remainder of it. When I got home to Phoenix, I made an appointment with my GP because I had developed a persistent ringing in my left ear, a low tonal sound, not quite a ring, something between a hum and a drone that I had first noticed on the 11th night. The audiologist found no structural damage, no explanation for the sound. I have had it for 3 years now. It is there right now as I tell you this. Some nights it is louder than others. On the nights when it is loudest, I do not look at pictures of the ocean, and I make sure my curtains are completely closed. I have spoken to Andre twice since the voyage. He quit the ship at the next port and has not worked on the water since. He told me, the last time we spoke, that he still sees the shape sometimes in his peripheral vision, not in water, just in his daily life, a dark mass in the edge of his vision that is gone when he turns to look at it. He has stopped talking about it to people who were not there. There is a particular kind of person who spends years learning to trust their own judgment, and there is a particular kind of horror that comes specifically for those people. The man whose account follows this one had spent the better part of 2 decades trusting himself in conditions that would have broken most people, and he was not prepared for the thing that found him anyway. My name is Marcus Webb, and I was 41 years old when this happened, a former Coast Guard search and rescue swimmer with 17 years of active service behind me, retired on a medical discharge after a shoulder injury, running photography workshops on the side because I needed something to do with my hands and my eyes. I booked a passage on a repositioning cruise, one of those long-haul trips where a ship moves from one home port to another at the end of the season, in this case from Barcelona to Fort Lauderdale with stops in the Azores and Bermuda, 12 days. Fewer passengers than a normal voyage, maybe 600 people on a ship designed for 1,400, which meant whole corridors of empty cabins, whole sections of the ship that were simply turned off for the crossing. I liked that. I am not a social person. I wanted the sea and the light and the uninterrupted horizon that you simply cannot find on land. The repositioning routes take you through water that most cruise passengers never see, deep Atlantic water, mid-ocean, days at a time between landfall, and that appealed to me in a way I still think was legitimate and not foolish. I had operated in worse water. I was not afraid of the sea. I want to be clear about that. The ship had a small photography group of about 15 people traveling together, and we had access to the upper decks at most hours for shooting. The light in the mid-Atlantic is extraordinary, a kind of clarity that you do not get close to land, and the first 5 days were among the best of my photographic life. Clear skies, smooth seas, and on the 4th night, a bioluminescent plankton bloom that lit the bow wake in cold blue fire. I photographed it for 3 hours. I was standing at the bow rail at around 2 in the morning when I noticed that one of the deck crew was also on the bow, standing very still about 30 feet away from me, looking out at the water. Nothing strange about that. I gave them a nod and went back to my camera. I shot for another hour, and when I finally looked up, the person was gone. I could not remember hearing them leave. The bow of a ship at night is not a quiet place. The wind and the hull noise make a constant low roar, and you would not necessarily hear a person walking away. I noted it without concern. and went to bed. 2 nights later, I was reviewing photographs in my cabin when I came across a frame I did not remember taking. It was a photograph of the stern deck, shot from the port rail, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on the previous night. I had been in the dining room at 11:47 the previous night, confirmed by a conversation I remembered clearly having with another photographer over coffee. I had not been on the stern deck. I had not taken that photograph. The photograph showed the stern deck empty of people, lit by the deck lighting, with the ship's wake stretching out behind it into the dark. And in the wake, maybe 50 yards behind the ship, there was something in the water, not beneath it. In it, at the surface, or just below, illuminated by the deck lighting at the edge of its range. I enlarged the photograph as far as the resolution allowed. The shape was large, much larger than a dolphin, longer than a person, and it appeared to be oriented toward the ship, toward the camera, as though it was watching. I showed the photograph to the ship's naturalist the following morning, a cheerful Dutch woman named Els, who had spent 20 years doing wildlife observation on cruise ships. She looked at it for a long time. Then she told me that the shape was consistent with a large marine mammal, and that the image quality was insufficient to make a positive identification. She asked to keep a copy of the image for her records. I gave her one. She looked at me before I left and said, quietly, that the mid-Atlantic route had shown her things that her training had not prepared her for, and that she always made a point of not standing alone at the stern rail after dark on the deep ocean crossings. She said it the way a person says something they have been wanting to say to someone for a long time. I thanked her and left. That night I woke up to find my cabin door open. I was certain I had closed it. The corridor outside was dim and empty. I closed the door and checked the lock mechanism, which appeared to be functioning normally. I lay back down and I became aware, slowly, of a sound underneath the floor of my cabin, which was several decks above the waterline. A low rhythmic vibration, not the engines. The engines I had catalogued in my first 2 days on board, running to frequency and tone, the particular signature of the propulsion system at cruise speed. This was different. It moved. It traveled from one side of the cabin floor to the other over the course of several minutes, a slow lateral progression that had no mechanical explanation I could construct. I stayed in my bunk and I listened, and I did not let myself move. I am a trained rescue swimmer. I know what physical fear feels like in the body, and I know how to manage it. I managed it, but I lay completely still until the sound stopped, and the sound stopped the same way the thing in Priya's account had stopped, all at once, without fading, as though something had simply chosen to end it. In Bermuda, I went ashore, and I sat in a bar for 3 hours, and I drank 2 beers, which for me was essentially nothing. And I looked at the photograph again on my laptop screen. The ship's captain, to his credit, did not dismiss me when I brought the matter of the photograph to his attention. He reviewed the metadata carefully, and he told me that the camera must have experienced a malfunction, that the timestamp had likely reset during a battery change, that I had probably taken the photograph and forgotten in the fatigue of the late nights. His explanation was thorough and measured and entirely reasonable. Except that I had not changed the battery on that camera in 4 days, and except that the photograph showed a weather vane on the stern mast, reading a wind direction that matched the recorded conditions for the specific date and time stamped on the file. If the timestamp was wrong, the wind direction was a coincidence, so precise it became meaningless to call it a coincidence. I finished the crossing. I arrived in Fort Lauderdale and went home to Michigan. And I spent 2 weeks processing images from the trip. The photograph is still on my hard drive. I have shown it to 3 marine biologists, 2 of them with specific expertise in deep Atlantic fauna. None of them have identified the shape. One of them, a researcher at a major university who asked not to be named, told me that the proportions of the shape as I had described them were not consistent with any documented species in that region, and that if I had documentation of something that size in mid-ocean surface water, I should consider publishing it. I asked her what she thought it was. She did not answer me. She looked at the image for a long moment, and then she handed my laptop back and said that the ocean was substantially less well mapped than most people believed, and that there were very good reasons why experienced sailors had always treated deep water with what she called productive superstition. I have not been on a ship since. I tell myself this is coincidence and scheduling and the shoulder injury that makes long journeys uncomfortable. I know that it is not. Not everyone on this list was a professional with specialized training. Some of the most precise accounts I have received came from ordinary people who simply noticed things more carefully than they were supposed to. The woman who comes next was traveling with her husband of 20 years on what was supposed to be an anniversary trip, and she has never taken another cruise. My name is Catherine Ilara. I was 52 years old, a high school history teacher with a particular interest in maritime history and a completely ordinary relationship with the ocean, which is to say, I respected it without fearing it and found it beautiful in the way most people find it beautiful. My husband Thomas and I booked a Mediterranean cruise for our 20th anniversary, 14 nights from Rome with stops in Sicily, Greece, Croatia, and Montenegro before ending in Barcelona. We had been saving for it for 4 years. It was, in every way that could be measured in the planning stage, a perfect trip. The ship was large and beautiful, and the weather for the first week was extraordinary, warm even in October. The sea, that particular deep blue that you can only see in the Mediterranean, a color that feels ancient because it is, because you are looking at the same water that carried Phoenician merchants and Roman galleys and every empire that ever tried to hold that part of the world. I loved every moment of the first week. I was happy. I want you to understand that because it matters for what comes after. On the 8th night, anchored off the coast of Montenegro, I woke up alone in the cabin. Thomas was a mild insomniac and frequently got up in the night to read in the cabin's small sitting area, and when I reached across the bed and found it empty, I assumed he had done that, and I started to go back to sleep. Then I noticed that the sitting area was dark and silent. I sat up. The cabin was empty. I checked the bathroom. I put on my robe and opened the cabin door and checked the corridor. Empty. I assumed he had gone for a walk on deck, which he occasionally did when he could not sleep, and I went back to bed and lay there awake, listening. 15 minutes passed, 20. I got up and went looking for him. I found him on the promenade deck, sitting on a bench at the rail, looking out at the water toward the dark coast of Montenegro. He was sitting very still with his hands on his knees and his face turned toward the shore, and when I sat down next to him and touched his arm, he turned to look at me with an expression that I still cannot completely describe. He looked like a person who had just heard something in a language they could not speak, but had almost understood. He asked me if I had heard the singing. I asked him what singing, and he looked back at the water and said there had been singing. A woman's voice, coming from the direction of the coast, very faint, and it had woken him up. We were anchored at least half a mile from the coast, and it was 3 in the morning, and there is no explanation I can give you for a woman's voice carrying across half a mile of open water at 3 in the morning. Thomas is an architect and one of the least imaginative people I have ever loved. He does not have experiences like this. He does not invent experiences like this. The following night we both heard it. We were in bed and not quite asleep, and it came through the hull of the ship, the way sound travels through water, distorted but undeniably present, and it was a human voice, or something structured the way a human voice is structured, syllables and breath and pitch, without forming words in any language I know. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, and then it was gone, and Thomas and I lay there in the dark, and neither of us said anything for a very long time. In the morning we told each other. It had been a sound from another cabin, music through a wall, something carried on the wind from the shore. We were still in Montenegrin waters. There was a small village on the coast. It was a completely reasonable explanation. We repeated it to each other twice over breakfast, and then we stopped talking about it. On the 12th night, 2 days before Barcelona, I was alone on the deck in the early evening, the sun just going down, watching the last of the light on the water, when I saw something floating about 40 feet off the port side. It was small and dark, and I thought at first it was a piece of debris, a bag, or a piece of packing material. Then it moved against the current, not with it, against it, moving toward the ship with slow, deliberate purpose. I watched it for perhaps 2 minutes. It came to within 20 feet of the hull and then it stopped. I was leaning on the rail looking down at it, and the light was going fast, and I could not make out what it was. It was roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate at the surface, and as the light failed it seemed to become less distinct rather than more, as though it were dissolving into the dark water around it. A crew member came past behind me, and I pointed and asked them what it was, and they looked over the rail and said they did not see anything. I looked back. The water was empty. The crew member walked on. I stood at that rail for another 20 minutes, in the full dark, watching the water, and I saw nothing else. I do not know how to account for the fact that an object I had been watching for 2 minutes was not visible to a person standing 3 feet away from me, looking at the same water. We arrived in Barcelona and went home to our lives and our house and the particular comfort of routine. Thomas had the singing in his ear for 2 weeks after we returned, the low tonal humming that he described exactly the way Priya described the sound in her ear, without using the word ring, using words like drone and intention. It faded. His faded after 2 weeks. When we are at the coast, which we sometimes are in summer, visiting friends, Thomas will occasionally stop what he is doing and look at the water with that same expression he had on the bench in Montenegro. I have stopped asking him what he is looking at. I know what he is looking at. He is listening for something. He has not heard it again, or if he has stopped telling me. There is a thing that happens to people who have had experiences like these, a slow and careful rearrangement of what they are willing to believe about the world. And the next person on this list was already deep in that rearrangement when his story found its way to me. My name is Jerome Akabi. I was 37 years old, and I was a commercial diver, 12 years working on underwater infrastructure, pipelines and cables, and the legs of offshore platforms, the kind of work where you spend a lot of time in very dark water, and you learn, profoundly and permanently, what the ocean looks like from the inside. I took a cruise not because I particularly wanted to, but because my sister was getting married on a cruise ship, and I was the best man, and there was no graceful way to decline. Caribbean route, 7 days, a perfectly pleasant ship, full of people celebrating a wedding. I was not looking for anything. I was not the type to look for anything. I was there for my sister. I want that context to be absolutely clear. The 3rd day we docked at a private island owned by the cruise line, one of those engineered paradise situations with rented snorkel gear and a swim-up bar and a stretch of beach that had been carefully groomed to look natural. I went snorkeling in the afternoon because the water was clear, and I am a diver, and clear water is always interesting to me, regardless of the context. The reef near the island was modest, nothing compared to what I had worked around professionally, but alive and colourful, parrotfish and sergeant majors, and a single large green moray, half hidden in a coral head. I had been in the water about 40 minutes, when I noticed that the fish had gone, not gradually, the way fish move away from something slowly, dispersing over several minutes. They were simply gone. One moment the reef was populated, and the next time I looked around it was empty. The moray was gone from its coral head. The sergeant majors were gone. In 12 years of diving, I had seen this happen twice. Once before a shark passed through, and once before a much larger shark passed through. I came up. I swam back to the beach. I sat on the beach and looked at the water for a long time. No other snorkelers reported anything unusual. The water remained clear and calm. I did not tell anyone what I had seen because I did not have anything concrete to tell. That night on the ship I was sitting on the balcony of my cabin after the wedding dinner, maybe midnight, enjoying the quiet, when I heard something strike the hull below me. One impact, firm and deliberate, like a knock. My cabin was on deck 4, about 15 feet above the waterline. I leaned over the balcony and looked down. The water alongside the hull was dark and flat and completely undisturbed. Nothing was there. I sat back down and 20 seconds later, I heard it again. Knock, below me, against the hull, and then again. 3 times, evenly spaced, and then nothing. I am a commercial diver. I know what things sound like when they hit a hull from the waterside. This was a precise impact, not debris in a current, not hull flex, not mechanical vibration. This was something making contact intentionally with the outer hull of the ship at a point 15 feet below the surface. I timed the interval between the knocks in my head, approximately 4 seconds between each one, the same rhythm. 3 times and then silence. I went to the ship's dive team in the morning. There was a small recreational dive operation on board, and I identified myself as a commercial diver and asked if they had had any reports of impacts on the hull during the night. The lead dive instructor was a young man who told me they had received no such reports, and that if something had struck the hull, it would have been picked up by the watch. I asked him to check the watch log for the previous night, and he made a call and came back and told me that the watch had logged an unexplained sonar return at approximately midnight on the port side at a depth of 12 to 15 feet, consistent with a large marine animal or object that had disappeared from the sonar after approximately 6 minutes. He seemed to think this resolved the matter. I asked him what kind of marine animal produces a sonar return consistent with a large object and then makes 3 deliberate, evenly spaced impacts against a hull and then disappears. He looked at me for a moment and said that sonar returns could be inconsistent at shallow depth near a hull, and that the impacts I had heard were most likely hull expansion from the change in water temperature overnight. I have worked in deep water for 12 years. Hull expansion does not produce 3 deliberate, evenly spaced impacts. I thanked him and walked away. The rest of the cruise passed without incident. My sister's marriage was beautiful, and I was good at my job as best man, and I smiled in all the photographs, and I drank the champagne, and I did not think about the knocking against the hull. I thought about it on the flight home. I thought about it for 3 months afterward. I have been back in the water since, on commercial jobs, and the work is the same, and I am the same diver I was before the cruise. But there is a thing that happens now when I am down deep and the water is dark, and I am working on something with my hands, and my back is to the open water, a sensation I did not have before. Not fear, something more precise, the awareness of being looked at from behind. I turn. There is never anything there. I turn back and I keep working, and the sensation does not leave. The stories I receive sometimes come in clusters from the same voyage, different people who did not know each other and who have never compared notes, arriving in my inbox months apart, describing the same ship. The next 2 accounts came from the same 14-day South American cruise, 2 years apart, and the details overlap in ways neither narrator could have engineered. My name is Sofia Vega, and I was 25 years old, a graduate student in marine biology, writing a thesis on deep-sea bioluminescence, which meant I was on the cruise for research purposes, spending most nights at the rail with a low-light camera system documenting the bioluminescent wake. My supervisor had arranged access to the ship's marine observation deck, and I had a formal letter from my university and a detailed research protocol, and I was thoroughly, professionally prepared for the work. I was not prepared for anything else. The first 6 nights were productive and scientifically satisfying. The South American coast produces extraordinary bioluminescent phenomena, and I was filling hard drives with footage and sleeping well and eating too much at the buffet and feeling the particular deep contentment of a researcher, in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. On the 7th night, I was at the observation deck around 2 in the morning when I noticed something in my footage that I could not account for. I had been filming the wake and a section of open water about 100 meters behind the ship, and in the footage, visible clearly in the camera's low-light sensor, even though it had not been visible to my naked eye, there were shapes moving in the water, multiple shapes, roughly cylindrical, between 1 and 2 meters in length by my estimation, moving in a formation that was not consistent with schooling fish behavior. Schooling fish move in coordinated lateral sweeps, in and out, the group maintaining its shape like a single organism. These shapes were moving in what I can only describe as a procession, single file, evenly spaced, traveling in the same direction as the ship, maintaining pace with it, at a depth my camera estimated at around 8 meters. They were not illuminated by bioluminescence. They were visible on the low-light sensor because they were slightly warmer than the surrounding water, which means they were living and metabolically active. I do not have a name for what they were. I reviewed the footage 4 times before I accepted that I was seeing what I was seeing. I showed the footage to the ship's naturalist, a different naturalist than the one Marcus encountered, a Brazilian ornithologist who had diversified into marine observation. She watched the footage twice, and then she told me that the shapes were consistent with large squid displaying schooling behavior. I asked her about the single-file procession. She said squid behavior was highly variable and not fully understood. She was not wrong about that. Squid behavior is highly variable and not fully understood. But I have spent 4 years studying deep-sea organisms, and I know what squid look like on a thermal sensor, and they did not look like squid. They were too regular, too evenly spaced. The interval between each shape in the procession was, as closely as I could measure it, identical. Living animals in a moving formation do not maintain identical spacing. Living animals bump into each other and speed up and slow down and lose formation and recover it. These shapes did not do that. They moved like a mechanism, like something that had been programmed rather than born. I continued my research and I filled my hard drives, and I went home and wrote my thesis and got my degree. The footage is in my archive. I have shown it at one conference, not as a finding but as an anomaly requiring further study, and the response from my colleagues was politely skeptical in the way that academic responses always are when you show them something that does not fit the existing models. One researcher, an older man who studies deep water megafauna, took me aside afterward and told me that the formation behavior I had described was consistent with accounts he had collected from fishermen working the same coastal waters over a period of 30 years. He was assembling a database. He had not published anything because he did not yet have enough to constitute a scientific paper. He asked for a copy of my footage. I sent it to him. I have not heard back from him in 14 months. His institutional email address no longer works. The second account from that same route came 18 months later, and it comes from a man named Hector Diaz, who was 44 years old when he traveled on what he described as the same vessel, same route, same time of year, working as a professional translator, accompanying a group of European tourists. He does not know Sofia Vega. They have never spoken. Hector's account does not mention bioluminescence or footage or thermal imaging. It describes something he saw from his cabin porthole at around 3 in the morning on the 8th night of the voyage. A line of shapes in the water alongside the ship, moving with it, visible because of the ship's deck lighting reflecting off the surface at a flat angle that created a kind of lateral illumination. He estimated 8 to 10 shapes, single file, evenly spaced. He watched them for 4 minutes before the ship's lighting angle changed and the surface reflection was lost. He knocked on his cabin mate's door to wake him. By the time his cabin mate got to the porthole, there was nothing visible. Hector reported what he had seen to the purser's desk the following morning. The purser told him it was almost certainly dolphins. There are no dolphins that travel in single-file formation. There are no dolphins that maintain identical spacing. Hector knew this. The purser, he told me, also seemed to know this, but the purser had a duty to the comfort of the passengers, and an explanation, any explanation, is more comfortable than none. I want to stay on the water for a moment longer before we move to our final 2 accounts, because the ocean at night, specifically the ocean at night, when you cannot see land in any direction, and the nearest help is hours away by air, is its own particular category of isolated. The woman who comes next had thought carefully about this before her voyage, and had decided she was at peace with it, and she was right up until she was not. My name is Renata Borowski. I was 31 years old, a forensic accountant who had been working 100-hour weeks for 2 years, and who had booked a solo cruise on the strong recommendation of a therapist who told me I needed to learn to be alone with myself in a comfortable environment. 11 days, Norwegian fjords, a smaller expedition-style ship carrying 240 passengers and about 90 crew. I had no experience on ships. I was not a water person, but I liked the idea of the fjords, the stillness of them, and the ship was small, and the passenger list was the kind of people who travel alone or in small pairs and do not need to be entertained every moment. I was nervous about the trip, and then, by the 3rd day, I was not nervous anymore. The fjords were everything I had been promised. The silence of them, the way the mountains come straight down into the water, the particular quality of the light filtered through cloud and reflected off water surfaces on both sides of the ship. I read 4 books in 3 days. I ate dinner alone at a table by the window and felt profoundly and unexpectedly content. I was not looking for anything. I was deliberately not looking for anything. On the 5th night, deep in the fjord system, in a section of water so enclosed by cliffs that the sky was a narrow strip above us, I heard a sound from the water that I can only describe as breathing. I was sitting on my cabin balcony, which was small and faced the cliff wall about 30 meters away, and the water between the ship and the cliff was absolutely still, black and still, and so reflective that you could see the stars in it. The breathing was slow and very large, the way an animal much larger than a human breathes, a long slow intake and a long slow exhale, and it was coming from below the surface. I watched the water. I could not see anything. The breathing continued for perhaps 2 minutes, and then it stopped, and the water remained completely still. I went inside and sat on my bed, and I was aware, for the first time since boarding the ship, of how completely enclosed we were. Cliff on one side, cliff on the other. The way in was the only way out, and we were not moving that night. We were anchored. In the morning I went to the naturalist's talk in the lounge, hoping for an explanation, and she discussed the fjord wildlife enthusiastically and at length, seals and porpoises and various seabirds. I asked about large animals in the fjord. She mentioned minke whales, which do occasionally enter fjord systems. I asked about the breathing sound, and she said that whale respiration at the surface could indeed be heard at considerable distances, particularly in enclosed high-walled spaces where sound traveled with unusual efficiency. This was a good explanation. It was a scientifically plausible explanation. I held on to it for the rest of the day. That night the ship was still anchored. I did not go out onto my balcony. I lay in bed reading, and at approximately 2 in the morning I heard, from somewhere below me, from somewhere in the water beneath the hull, a sound that was not breathing. It was a series of long low tones, almost musical in structure, rising and falling, not the clicks and chirps of cetacean communication that I had heard in recordings, something different in quality, slower and more complex, with long pauses between phrases that felt grammatical, the way pauses in a conversation feel grammatical. It lasted perhaps 8 minutes. I have never been able to explain why I did not move from my bed, why I did not go to the porthole to look, why I simply lay there with the book face down on my chest and listened as though listening was the only correct response. When it stopped, I got up and looked out the porthole. The water was dark and still, and the reflection of the stars was undisturbed. There was nothing at the surface. I finished the voyage. The Norwegian coast in the last 4 days was beautiful, and I genuinely enjoyed it. And I felt, mostly, that I was all right. I told no one on the ship about what I had heard. When I got home, I told my therapist, who listened carefully and said that the experience of being deeply alone in a vast environment sometimes produces auditory phenomena that are real as experiences, even if not external in origin, and I appreciated her care. But I am a forensic accountant. My entire professional life is built on the discipline of distinguishing between what the numbers actually say and what a client hopes they say. I know the difference between something I invented and something that was there. What I heard was there. I sleep with white noise now because the silence of my apartment, on some nights, begins to have a quality that reminds me of the quality of the water in that fjord, deep and patient and listening. And I would rather not feel that while I am trying to rest. We are near the end of what we have tonight, and I want to give the last of the water to 2 people whose accounts I have returned to more than any others in the years I have been doing this work. The first is a woman who was doing her job. The second is a man who was simply trying to get from one place to another. Both of them found what they were not looking for, the way the water always provides it, without warning and without apology. My name is Ingrid Haugen, and I was 48 years old, a ship's officer with 22 years of sea service, licensed for large passenger vessels, working as the safety officer on a transatlantic crossing from Southampton to New York. 1,900 passengers, 700 crew, 7 days on the North Atlantic in early November, which is not a comfortable time on the North Atlantic, but which is a well-understood one. I had done this crossing 8 times. The particular texture of it, the way the swells stack up in the Labrador Current, the way the light changes as you approach the western side, the color of the water deepening from gray-green to the almost black of deepening from gray-green to the almost black of deep Atlantic. I was comfortable. I was professional. On the fourth night, past the midpoint of the crossing, in approximately 9,000 feet of water, I was doing a late safety check of the restricted engineering access points on the lower decks when I found a door open that should not have been open. It was a door to a below waterline access corridor that connected two sections of the ship's underbelly, used only for maintenance. It had been locked. I had checked it myself on my previous round. I stood in front of the open door, looking into the lit corridor beyond, and I listened. The corridor was approximately 60 feet long, painted utility gray, lit by recessed fluorescent strips, ending in a T-junction. It looked completely normal. I called out, identifying myself by rank. No response. I walked the corridor. I checked both branches of the T-junction. Both were empty and locked. I came back through and locked the access door and finished my round and logged it as a possible latch failure. 2 nights later, the same door was open again. I know it was locked. I had checked it 3 times on my previous round specifically because of the first incident. I stood in front of it again, and this time, standing in the opening, I could feel that the temperature in the corridor was wrong, lower than it should have been by what I estimated at 8 to 10 degrees. The HVAC systems in those access corridors run continuously, and there is no mechanism for a single section to drop 8 degrees below ambient without triggering an alert in the monitoring system. No alert had been triggered. I took out my phone and activated the thermometer function and walked the corridor. The main section read about 54 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough, normal enough. At the T-junction, the temperature read 44 degrees. I turned left, 37 degrees. I turned right. The right branch was secured as before. I was standing at the right-hand branch junction, thermometer reading 37 degrees, and I heard something at the far end of the right-hand branch, behind the locked door, in the section of the ship beyond it. A dragging sound, long and slow and deliberate, something being moved across a metal floor. It lasted about 8 seconds. Then it stopped. I am a 22-year ship's officer. I do not frighten easily, and I do not abandon my post. I stood there at that T-junction in 44-degree air, and I listened to the silence after the dragging sound for about a minute. Then I left the corridor, locked the access door, and went directly to find the chief engineer. The chief engineer came back with me within 20 minutes. The temperature in the corridor was reading normal across its entire length. We checked the locked right-hand branch. Nothing was behind it. The chief engineer looked at my face and said, with some care, that the corridor temperatures sometimes fluctuated due to proximity to the refrigeration systems, and that the sound I had described was most likely hull flex exacerbated by the sea state, which had been building all evening. The sea state had been building. The hull was working. He was not wrong to offer that explanation. I accepted it because I needed to finish my shift, and because accepting it was easier than not accepting it. I wrote a detailed account in my personal log that night, because I have always kept a personal log, and because the professional log requires explanations, and I did not have one. The dragging sound is what stays with me. Hull flex is irregular. Hull flex stutters and pops and groans. What I heard was 8 seconds of something moving at a steady pace across a floor. It had a direction. It was going somewhere. I completed the voyage and disembarked in New York and flew home to Bergen and took 3 days off and went back to sea the following week on a different vessel. I have not been back on a transatlantic November crossing since. The chief engineer, whom I contacted 6 months later with a question about the incident, told me that the door to that access corridor had been welded shut after the voyage following what he described as a structural assessment. I asked him if that was standard procedure after a latch failure. He was quiet for a moment, and then he told me that the recommendation had come from the ship's captain, personally, and that he had not been given a detailed reason for it. The door is still welded shut as far as I know. The ship is still in service. The last account tonight belongs to a man named Raymond Park, 59 years old, a retired teacher from a coastal town in South Carolina, who had never been on a cruise before, and who booked one in the year after his passed away, because she had always wanted to go on one, and he felt he owed it to her memory, to do the things they had planned together. He went alone, 7 nights, Caribbean. He described himself to me as a man who did not believe in anything supernatural, who had taught high school English for 31 years, and who placed his faith entirely in things that could be measured and verified. He told me this not as a boast, but as a context, the way a person who has had their context changed describes the world before the change. Raymond was in his cabin on the 4th night when he heard, from the cabin directly above his, the sound of someone walking, not unusual. Passengers walk in their cabins, but Raymond told me that the walking had a quality he kept trying to find words for, and eventually the word he used was purposeful. Back and forth, not the random movement of someone who cannot sleep, but the measured, deliberate pacing of someone waiting. It went on for 2 hours. He tried to sleep. He could not. At around 3 in the morning it stopped. In the morning at breakfast, he got into a conversation with the passenger whose cabin was above his, a retired school principal from Ohio, who told Raymond that she had slept soundly all night and was in the habit of sleeping very soundly, and that she had certainly not been walking around at 3 in the morning. Raymond mentioned it to no one else. On the 6th night, the pacing began again, same time, same quality, and this time Raymond got up and went upstairs and knocked on the cabin above his. The retired principal answered in her robe, clearly just woken up, and said she had been asleep and had not heard anything. Raymond apologized and went back to his cabin and stood in the middle of his floor and listened to the pacing above him. The principal's cabin was directly above. He was standing beneath it. The sound was directly above him. She was not making it. He told me that he stood there for a very long time, and he thought about his wife, and he thought about the year since she had died, and he thought about what she would have said to him, standing alone in a cabin in the middle of the Caribbean, listening to something that should not have been there. He thought she would have told him to go back to bed and to stop looking for reasons to be awake at night. He thought she was right, and he thought she was not fully right, and he went back to bed. The pacing stopped at 4:30 in the morning. He timed it. Both nights, it stopped at 4:30. He did not look up what might be significant about 4:30 in the morning. He told me that some questions you do not pursue because the answer will not make you feel better about what you already know. He arrived home from the cruise and told his son about the pacing. His son, who is a physician, suggested that the ship's structure had created an acoustic anomaly that was routing sound from another location through the hull in a way that sounded proximate, but was not. Raymond said yes, that is probably what it was. He told me that he has replayed the sound in his memory many times since then. The quality of those footsteps, the precise measured back and forth, the way it felt like waiting, and that he cannot make the acoustic anomaly explanation fit the shape of it. He booked another cruise the following year. He told me he is not sure why. He told me he is going on that cruise regardless. He told me that she had wanted to go, and he was going to keep going until it felt finished. He does not know when it will feel finished. He is not sure it will. This is where we leave the water for tonight. 9 people, 9 ships, 9 different corners of the ocean. None of them went looking for what they found. None of them have complete answers. Some of them have marks on their skin, or sounds in their ears, or footage on their hard drives that they cannot explain and cannot stop thinking about. The sea is older than every story we tell about it, and larger than every map we have drawn of it, and the things that live in the space between what we know and what we have not yet been able to measure do not require our belief in order to continue existing. If you have had an experience on the water that you have not been able to explain, the link to share it with us is in the description below. We read everything. If you are new to Midnight Outcry, this is what we do here. Stay with us. We are just getting started.